And now, after years of turmoil at Columbia, the university has named a new president, legal scholar Jennifer Nukin. You'll recall the school was home to major protests after October 7th, and now, along with other U.S. higher learning institutions, it is struggling to manage threats from the Trump administration. Lee Bollinger is one of America's most well-known academic leaders, including as Columbia's president for over 20 years. And his new book, University: A Reckoning, is a call for academic institutions to stand up against the pressure from the White House. Here he is with Michelle Martin.
Thanks, Fiona. Lee Bollinger, thank you so much for talking with us.
My pleasure.
I should say, Mr. President, because you've led two of our most prestigious and competitive universities, the University of Michigan and Columbia University. And I actually should mention that these were not placid times when you were leading these institutions. There were student protests, there was congressional scrutiny, there was political pressure, there were sort of political currents. But obviously, you wrote this book thinking that there's something special about this moment. So what is it about this moment that strikes you as different?
Well, I think the first thing is the federal government assault and intrusion into the academic affairs of universities. So that has not really happened, certainly not to this degree, for decades. I mean, you really have to go back to the McCarthy period. Mm-hmm. Which was really about one senator leading a campaign of intolerance. You have to go back to that for something comparable. And so the level of intrusion, the threat to academic freedom, the need to think about universities and their role in the Constitution and the First Amendment is much more imperative today than it really has been in modern history. So that's really the precipitating reason for the book.
In your book, you write, "We are, in short, witnessing a tectonic shift in America toward the use of authoritarian tactics that threaten our democratic form of government. The university is among the first, along with the press, of the major independent institutions in society to feel the brunt of this new and frightening transformation." I mean, so your point here is that, yes, the universities and the press are on the leading edge of this, but this is really about democracy. What convinces you of that? Why do you say that?
I think it's both about democracy and about fundamental values in the country. I mean, we've seen from the very start of the administration efforts to try to silence and really attack law firms, media, civil service, independent agencies that provide the nation with objective information like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and then universities. The business community has also faced this. If there's any kind of opposition, there's an effort to come down very hard on them and to try to silence them. So this is something that you really cannot have if you're going to be committed to a democracy and if you're going to be committed to a nation that values knowledge and independent information and knowledge. And that's where we have been for the past century. And it would be a tragedy to lose that.
As a person who, presumably just through your own work, as a scholar, as a lawyer, as a leader of these prominent institutions, you've met a lot of these industry leaders. And one of the things that you pointed out is that a lot of them folded over pretty fast. Amazon, was going to or talked about having some sort of indicator on their website of the cost of the Trump administration's sort of tariff scheme on different products. And of course, he threatened them and they immediately folded. A number of law firms, right? Some of the finest, most distinguished lawyers in the country, he threatened them. They folded. I'm just curious why you think they've capitulated so quickly.
Yeah. So I think this has come, the whole sort of affair has taken people by surprise. People have been shocked by the level of assault on basic values and basic institutions. And so we were not prepared for it. I think it's just a combination of it's very, very difficult to face a situation in which the government's full power, which is immense, can be brought down on you and face what everybody will always say, an existential choice. Do you capitulate? Do you try to find a way out of this, even if that means sacrificing some of your values? Or do you stand up and try to fight back? That's a really hard problem, and I'm very sympathetic to the people who have felt and institutions who have felt that they had to find a way to save their institutions by negotiation and conciliation. But it is the case that the only way in which you can effectively counter this is by collective action. It's not by an individual institution or a single sector of the society. Everybody who writes about the democracies, the end of democracies, and so on, I mean, all the scholarship points out that it's only when civil society broadly sort of acts and rises up and said this cannot stand, that you really have effective resistance.
A lot of people, see universities in lots of different ways. I mean, some people see colleges and universities as places you go to learn stuff so you can get a job. They're engines of the economy. Why should someone, perhaps who didn't have the chance to go to a university, embrace that idea?
I think people understand in their hearts that having major institutions, but of all kinds, from community colleges all the way through to the highest research universities, that it is really valuable for the society to have this kind of effort, human effort, to expand knowledge, because it benefits the society in all kinds of ways. Everything from economic development to simply making it possible to understand life. And it applies not just to the people who come and are students or to the faculty who are there, but it benefits everybody in the society. I think also that, there is a campaign that's been going on for many years of people who want to characterize universities as in very negative stereotypes, as filled with intolerance, ideological, not scholarly, too costly, et cetera, et cetera. And while there are fair criticisms about universities, many of which I have made myself, the fact of the matter is, if you look at all the parts of the society and you say which ones have the most integrity in pursuing what their mission is, I think universities are at the very forefront of that. And the proof is, in part, that everybody in the world wants to come and attend universities in America because they really are the standard for this.
Well, they did. That might not be the case anymore. I mean, the number of international students coming to the United States has really fallen precipitously. It's interesting. The irony being,
but not because of the quality of universities.
But because of the political environment. The irony is that these concrete financial pressures being placed on universities are having a deleterious effect on kind of the research flow. We see that, top scholars, research dollars are flowing to, Canada, to China. Some $400 million in grants and contracts frozen at Columbia, $510 million at Brown, $1 billion at Cornell, $790 million at Northwestern, much of it tied to demands about governance or compliance. What do you think the consequence of this is going to be down the line?
This idea of the Trump administration of suspending that kind of funding for that kind of research is foolhardy, but it's also striking at the basic values that we have committed ourselves to. And it may sound idealistic, but the First Amendment, the Constitution of the country, has made it very clear that the value of knowledge and the preservation of democracy, the making it possible to be a democracy, which is very, very difficult to do, that these are what the country is committed to. And the things we're talking about, Michelle, of fundamental research in these areas and beyond, in the liberal arts as well, that's threatened by this kind of use of the lever of funding to accomplish intrusions into pure academic decision making, faculty, students, policies of the universities.
The fact is that on the one hand, there are people, even if you accept what a lot of people believe, which is that the campus climate is just a pretext for an authoritarian impulse, there are still a lot of people who feel, and certainly have felt, particularly, let's just say it, in the wake of the Gaza war, that there are students who are just under attack on some of these campuses, and that they have felt silenced, and some of them have felt harassed and deeply unwelcome. And I just wonder how you sort of square those two, I don't want to call it realities, but two phenomena. Well, let's just sort of call it that. How do you square those two things?
So there's no question over the past year and a half, we faced an incredibly difficult situation on American campuses, but also in the society generally, in trying to understand and deal with questions of policy and principle with the Israeli, Palestinian, Hamas issues, but also with race in America, with abortion in America, rights of abortion. I mean, these are incredibly difficult issues for people to address, and when that happens, unfortunately, there are excesses, and you have to be very clear if you are in an institution or if you run an institution that excesses are unacceptable and will be treated as such. But you also have to understand that you have to have very clear ideas about excesses. The First Amendment, over the past century, again, has said, the court has held over many decisions, conservatives, liberals alike, that hate speech, that anti-Semitic, that racist speech, that sexist, misogynistic speech will be protected by the First Amendment, just like any other idea. That's a very, very significant choice and a very difficult one, and something that I've written about over the course of my career. Universities, public universities, are bound by that because they're bound by the First Amendment. Private universities have made a choice. They too will be bound by the First Amendment. What that means is that when you are having debates about public issues on campuses and you're committed to a First Amendment approach, you may end up with very, very bad speech being spoken, which is horrible for many people to have to deal with and horrible for the community at large. But you cannot say that that is itself something that the universities have failed to correct for, when in fact the commitment has been in the society and now on campuses to live by First Amendment for all kinds of reasons.
In your essay for The Atlantic last May, you wrote that strategies of appeasement never work out. At some point, when sanity returns, you will be seen as having sacrificed your principles when under pressure, and that will undermine your case forever. So you draw a contrast between universities that negotiated settlements in Harvard, which chose to resist and won an injunction, blocking what a judge called an arbitrary and capricious funding suspension. Based on what you've seen, has Harvard gotten it right so far? And is that a path that others should follow?
Universities, like other institutions, were surprised and shocked by the level of intrusion and demands and the threats that they faced. Completely understandable, in my view, that universities would respond in different ways, and it would be very difficult to organize collective action. Myself, I think that the Harvard approach was the right one, especially for Harvard, because the level of intrusion was much more than for other universities, at least so far. So I do think, and the point of this book is to try to say that universities need to be much clearer about what their identity is in the society, their role and responsibilities. They need to make that claim, and they need to do it in various ways, but through the courts and the First Amendment and law is a primary way. So yes, I think that standing up and articulating your values and making your defense is the right approach.
And I recognize that this has to be an awkward question for you as the former leader of this institution, but you do realize that for many people, Columbia is the poster child for appeasement.
So I've made a deliberate choice not to criticize directly, criticize my institution and the one that I led for 21 years. One has to be, as I said, very sympathetic with institutions who are trying to struggle with how to deal with the attacks that they have endured.
So what do you think people should do right now? People who share the perspective that you share, people who share the concern, the deep concern that you've articulated, and people who also share the love of knowledge and of free thought that you've articulated.
So I think we need to settle on the core identity of what universities are. So it's just critical to me that we can't fall for this idea that universities are just businesses or that they are only for elites, that, all of these standard criticism. It really is important that universities say who they are and say that with conviction. I think it's also important that universities find ways to act together. This kind of collective action is critical, but it also has to be across sectors, so it has to be with the press. Michelle, you would have to agree, I think, that the press has also failed to develop a collective kind of response to the various intrusions. Same with law firms, same with businesses. Anybody who is a scholar of democracy and how you preserve it in the face of attempts to undermine democracy will say that it's only when civil society broadly stands up and resists that you can have an effective resistance to a government that is intent on achieving its goal of undermining any kind of opposition. That is something that requires daily work. It requires work of many, many people, and you never know exactly how it's going to unfold, but that has to happen.
Lee Bollinger, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you, Michelle.
Now, the 2024 election showed more and more Black, Latino, and Asian Americans turning to Trump. It's been puzzling experts ever since. A professor at Yale may have an answer to the diversity emerging in the MAGA base. Daniel Martinez-Hosang joins Michelle Martin to explain the politics of the multiracial right.
Thanks, Christiane. Professor Daniel Martinez-Hosang, thank you so much for talking with us.
Oh, such a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation today, Michelle.
Yeah, likewise. So you've been writing about race and politics for a long time now. A lot of us follow your work. You recently wrote a really eye-catching piece for the New York Times where you explored the rise of a multiracial conservative movement in the United States. And this is something that people have talked about for a long time. I mean, a lot of people kind of felt was overblown, or they felt it was episodic, or they felt it was tied to, say, a specific movement. What do you think you add to the conversation with your piece?
Part of what I was trying to say is that for this piece, we know that in the last election, the estimates are something like 45 to 50% of Latino voters cast their ballot for Trump. Maybe 40% of Asian American voters. Black support for Trump is much less, but it, by some estimates, doubles from the previous election. And as you said, many people imagine, well, was there an ad there? Was it a candidate choice? Was it, a different show someone, Kamala Harris should have gone on? And part of what I wanted to lay on this piece is that this is a much longer and deeper and really more structural story. When people are talking about what led them to this place where they identify as conservative, conservative. They might support Trump. Some even identify as kind of MAGA folks. There is a longer story behind that. It's not just tied to one election. And I think even folks who do not agree with these politics, the positions they hold, it is so important to understand those deeper experiences.
And one of the reasons that this stands out is that, Barack Obama. I mean, the fact is, his first election and his second put together this multiracial coalition. So obviously, you've talked about the appeal we're going to talk more about this, the appeal of Donald Trump. But is it primarily the appeal of Donald Trump or the appeal of a movement, or is it a kind of disillusionment, disdain with the Democrats? I guess the question is, did Republicans win or did the Democrats lose?
Yeah. So, it's a little of both. And I think it's so important, Michelle, to go back to 2012, because at that moment, we're talking about something like 80% of voters of color, Black, Asian American, Latino voters who cast a ballot are supporting Barack Obama. Even at that time, the Republican the RNC says we're in deep danger. We've lost 2 elections in a row. All our focus groups and polling are telling us it feels like we're out of touch. Young voters of color find us kind of stuck in the past. If we don't kind of modernize our image, our accessibility, we are doomed. This is Republicans saying that. And
they had a whole project around this. It was led by Ed Gillespie, a former Republican chief of staff. It was, what did they have a name for it? Like an autopsy?
It was the autopsy report.
The autopsy, which is kind of dire. But
I just, this is not that long ago. This is less than 15 years ago. And they're saying, like, we are doomed politically. And I think that was the sensibility, which is that the kind of demography is destiny. The electorate continues to change. And that can only benefit in a partisan way the Democrats. And so
what happened?
Well, yes. So I mentioned in the piece, like Obama's inauguration, because the theme in 2012, it was all about optimism. Our best days are in front of us. We have so much to look forward to and give. But, scratch the surface there. The foreclosure and housing crisis, which had been underway for 3 or 4 years, it devastated communities of color in even more dramatic ways than, even kind of white working class and conservative voters. The opioid and addiction and healthcare crisis that started in some parts of the country within 4 years was in every city. So you just saw, and then we have COVID. So there was some, voters kept describing to me, it's not that I was opposed to the soaring rhetoric and the symbolism. I was drawn to that. A good number of folks I interviewed who were on the right today said, I voted for Obama. Several said I volunteered for his campaign. I was so excited. But in the next 4 years, I did not see anything change. And my sense of the disconnect between the talk and the action in my own neighborhood grew and grew and grew. And so many people noted that.
One of the people you interviewed, Sam Gonzalez, identifies as a gay Latino man. And he had voted Democrat before. But here's again why this is so fascinating, because so many people identify Donald Trump in particular and the sort of Trumpism or the MAGA movement as being anti-Latino, hostile to immigrants, and increasingly hostile to gays, transgender people who are part of the LGBTQ movement. So what happened? What's Sam Gonzalez's story? What was the appeal for him?
So this is the Rio Grande Valley, South Texas, which for generations had been just a staunchly and reliably Democratic, largely Latino, Mexican American voting base. And part of what I, traced out is that wasn't just, their kind of independent attitudes or preferences. There was real organization there. There's, unions and civic organizations and local Democratic parties and radio stations. And so many people said that's why for just generations, we never thought about Republicans. It's very important to understand after 2012, the right started to pick up on new opportunities in these communities. They started sending organizers. They started knocking on doors. The Koch network, libertarian network, created this Libre initiative to start connecting with people. So that sense that people have no other alternatives, which for generations had been true, wasn't true. The second thing is with someone like Sam, part of what he said is like, I am a proud gay man. I'm proudly Latino. But that doesn't mean that that's my only way that I think about myself politically. He says, I'm also Christian. that also shapes how we think about gender, how we think about religion and faith. And his sense was there's assumptions among the Democrats that if you just look at him and say he's a gay Latino man, these are the policy preferences. What Sam is describing is true for many more people than we acknowledge. We sometimes talk about it now as having heterodox politics, mixing and matching around immigration, around gender, around work, around security, et cetera. They don't just neatly fall into left-right categorizations.
Some people identify the attraction of some of these voters to Donald Trump because of sexism. He presents as a very sort of traditional male. I'm rich, I'm loud, I'm unapologetic, I do what I want. Yeah. And some people sort of identify the appeal to some, particularly Black men, as being part of that. What did you find in your reporting?
I mean, we certainly cannot underestimate the role of patriarchy, gender politics, and attraction to that. I wouldn't, dismiss it in any way. I will say, though, that I don't think that explains all or even most of what we're seeing. Many of the folks I talked to, again, talked about, in a place like Milwaukee where schools, public funding, access to services, they've just been decimated across the last 2 decades. That's what people were repeatedly talking about, like my neighborhood, the sense of, safety, other kinds of things. And for them, in part just of the kind of two-party system and how it's often Democratic leaders who have had, are in charge of governance of multiracial cities. The blame for that is going to be put at the feet of the Democrats. They're saying, we've tried to redress, and nothing seems to change. And again, in a two-party system, this is the only alternative.
How do they explain the fact that the way that Donald Trump expresses himself often people experience as anti-Blackness?
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious, how some of the people you talk to, how do they deal with that? How do they think about that?
Yeah. I mean, first, I just want to say, just to acknowledge, right, Donald Trump, he insulted and denigrated, civil rights icon John Lewis. He talked about a city like Baltimore as kind of broken, trash. He used profanity to talk about African countries and immigrants.
Not to mention the first campaign talking about immigrants from, Mexico in particular, Latin America in general, as being, criminals as a
criminals
group.
And predators.
They're not sending our best. They're not sending their best, And
then, the Springfield, Ohio and the eating cats, and right, it's just never ending. But I'll say in these conversations, the voters that I talked to, how they would respond, and just to imagine how they'd respond to this important question, would say, I don't take that seriously. I don't think he's it's being distorted and misrepresented. They're trying to use it to score political points. And I actually don't really care about that kind of back and forth. So they say, to me, it's a little bit of theater and performance. I'm focused on what's going to make a change. The other thing is many people said, look, as a Democrat, I've also tolerated a lot of, from their perception, liberal racism from Democrats that they find condescending and patronizing. So the idea that once you get a taste of how much they dislike you, you'll realize, something right. I think Black voters especially have long navigated a Democratic Party that has been also ambivalent about them and has shown, remorse and distaste and tolerated conditions that didn't honor their dignity. So, people might also just stay there in those complex ways and try to see what still might be possible versus saying, gosh, this was all, I've been hoodwinked. I'm going to go back to some other place where people will honor me. I talked to most of these folks after inauguration in those first 90 days when, remember, Michelle, there was just these dramatic changes, Department of Education, right? All these agencies shut down. And I said, well, is this what you wanted? And almost every person said he's doing what he said he would, which is he's an outsider. He's disrupting the status quo. He's rooting out the perceived corruption, et cetera. So I just think that, and just as the last thing I'll say, to remember, right, the week before the election, there was a Trump rally in Madison Square Garden. A comment said, made this comment about Puerto Rico as comparing it to garbage. But immediately people said, well, there goes his support among Puerto Rican voters. But the next day, I was talking to a journalist in Pennsylvania, and he's saying there's tons of Puerto Rican flags here. People continue to support it. So part of what they think is it's both not serious. He's not really talking about me. And this is just kind of what his opponents are doing to try to discredit him.
What about Asian American voters? Talk about that.
So like Latino voters, this is a really, really diverse group, lots of different experiences. The dramatic growth in the Asian American electorate also means, again, lots of different occupations and things that are shaping, it's not just about education or access to the Ivy Leagues. There's many things. I talked to a group of mostly Chinese American voters in San Francisco. What was really foremost on their mind, especially those who had like very small mom and pop shops, was a sense of like order and safety, and they run on very, very small margins. Could they open their store so that they could just make enough to pay the rent? And San Francisco as a city, like many others, has a profound housing affordability crisis. It has an addiction crisis that's just spilled everywhere. So there's a sense that there's these colossal problems, and there's very, very few Republicans who are representing those voters. So again, it's Democrats who get caught with the kind of like, you haven't done anything about it. And that's partly what, for a lot of those voters, it's actually not their experiences with communism or authoritarianism in their home countries. It's wanting to fix things. Yeah, it's local.
The question I have is that I take your point that a lot of the people you interviewed, they want to change. They're tired of the status quo and they want to change, and Trump represents change. What happens if he doesn't deliver?
Yeah, I'll just say two things there. One is, I think that there's a whole set of voters who don't wake up every morning thinking about what the legislation is, what its impact was, et cetera. And so they're not going to see it in a kind of cost benefit way. And Trump is so skilled at continually producing, demons, people who are culpable, et cetera. So as long as that churn kind of keeps going, I think he feels like even in a place where he hasn't delivered promises about everything that's going to change, he still benefits. The other thing, part of this work, we've gone to a lot of right-wing conferences, including this group Turning Point USA has a big conference in Phoenix every year. You'll see them very accurately talking about problems and challenges in people's lives. You will rarely hear them talk about solutions. And I think it's because they've picked up on something. People are exhausted, they're lonely and isolated. They want some acknowledgement that that's a real feeling. Their sense that you can actually do something is an open question. And that's the space they're kind of inhabiting, if that makes sense.
There used to be a kind of a broad sense of identity among certain groups. Is there a bigger issue around identity with people of color in this country where that just isn't as foregrounded in their lives? Yeah.
I think what's happened is precisely what you're saying. I would say for a generation of Latino voters, that was often true as well. Even if I'm a citizen, I'm not from a mixed status household, if they're talking about them, they're talking about all of us. There was a really important poll done by the New York Times and Siena College in the fall, and it asked all these Latino voters, when Donald Trump is talking about immigrants, do you think he's talking about you? A majority said, no, he's not talking about me. And so I think that sense of both, you're talking about the kind of lumping, but there's also that splitting, right? There's a them and an us within all of these communities. And I think that's partly what he's been effective at speaking to. And he will say, I believe in you. I believe in your work ethic, your faith, your ability, your love for family. That's who I believe in. All these other corrupt forces, they don't believe in you. I believe in you. So that's the other thing I've seen is so it's not a de-emphasizing of identity or even cultural pride.
On the other hand, we've seen this, for example, mass deportation scheme, ensnaring people who, are not immigrants, some who are citizens, some who have been here for decades. And so the question I have is, conversely, could the way President Trump is going about implementing some of these policies, even though they were attractive to voters, be causing buyer's remorse? Particularly among some of these people who are newly part of this coalition. Yeah.
I think there's no doubt, and I think it's reflected in more recent polling among Latino Trump supporters, that it has dampened and their enthusiasm and support, and it's not in line with their understanding of what a fair immigration enforcement is. So absolutely. But we also can't underestimate some sense that there are a significant number of folks who identify as immigrants, immigrant families, who also are persuaded by robust enforcement practices. And the Republicans are trying to find what that line is. But the idea that just the specter and the scare of these raids alone will move everyone back, I think on the ground, it's going to be more complex.
is there any hope for Democrats?
I actually think in some ways, these people that move to the right, they actually have some hope. They're not the folks who are just altogether withdrawing. They're actually wondering, like, well, maybe there is some other possibility here. So that's what I found, encouraging, is that people want that. They want dignity for themselves. I actually didn't hear a lot of people just rehashing the same attacks on neighbors and you kind of hear that from the stage, but I don't think that's the world people want to live in. And I think the rebuilding process happens at the local level when people can kind of see that trust in action. It's not just about drafting a new candidate or figuring out one new podcaster to fix this. It's really doing what the generation before did, building this local infrastructure of connection and hope and possibility and love that people feel connected to. That's where I think there's real opportunity.
Professor Daniel Martinez-Hosang, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks, Michelle. Such a delight to talk to you.
What happens when it's not just a President Trump, and I use him because he's the usual suspect? Look, he took the US twice out of the Paris Climate Accords, which you negotiated. 195 people, you were the UN's chief negotiator on all of that. But what happens when a Bill Gates starts to roll back? When he, who's been in the forefront of not just health solutions around the world, but about climate. He's just written a very much, discussed memo that was released saying that climate change is a serious problem, but will not end civilization. Temperature is not the best way, he says, to measure our progress on climate. Health and prosperity are the best defenses against climate change. He also wrote COP30 is a chance to refocus on the metric that should count even more than emissions and temperature change. That is improving lives. And you responded?
I responded, it's very understandable that Bill Gates, who is a friend, thinks in binary terms because all of the computing world is based on binary thinking. Ones and zeros. That is the basis of computing. So it's very understandable that he does this binary thinking and binary analysis. However, the real world is not binary. The real world is actually interconnected. And so there is no use in us exclusively dealing with health, with poverty, if we don't also protect people against the ravages of climate change. And sadly for him, he published this memo exactly in the time in which Melissa hit Jamaica. Yeah. And so the question, is let's ask the Jamaicans whether even if they had had perfect health and perfect quality of life, would that have protected them against Melissa? The answer is no.
Indeed,
we have to do both.
Indeed, you did an extensive X or Instagram response. Sorry, Bill Gates, no amount of human welfare in Jamaica would have stopped, prevented, or reduced the impact of Category 5. Melissa, so let's now talk about hurricanes, because this is also, everything becomes political. Everything becomes political. So people will say, well, it's not global warming that creates hurricanes. And I think scientists also agree, but it is global warming and sea warming particularly that creates their ferocity and the more and more.
Exactly.
And that is something, the amplification. And yes. I wonder, where are we? I mean, they've just had didn't they have a oceanic report recently? I mean, the oceans are really getting hotter.
They are getting much warmer, and that's the issue. Just to take Melissa as one example, it might have been a Category 2 or 3 or maybe maximum 4 hurricane, but it got to 5 very, very quickly because on its path, it passed over oceans that were 3 degrees warmer than they should be. And because the ocean is warmer, that means there's more evaporation. The hurricane takes in more and more humidity and becomes much more ferocious. So let no one say that climate change produces hurricanes, but it definitely makes them more ferocious and very likely more frequent.
Here in Brazil, the Minister of the Environment has talked about Tropical Forest Forever Fund.
Yes.
What do you understand that means?
That is a very courageous and visionary enterprise that Brazil is launching to do something that we should have done many years ago, and that is protect standing forests and recover lands that have been deforested, and do it especially through empowering and financing indigenous peoples who own and have protected at least 40% of the forest canopy and forest cover of this planet, and have never been given the support to continue that very important protective role that they play. So Brazil, I think, is doing something very important at this COP. They're bringing two issues that have never been front and center, and they're putting it front and center. One is, what are we going to do about land use? Because most of us, me included, focus on energy because it's 75% of global emissions. But we tend to forget that 25% comes from inadequate land use, and that needs to be addressed, especially because there are so many lives, both human and more than human lives, that depend on the health of our forest cover. So they're putting land use front and center, and indigenous peoples and First Nations peoples. That is very unusual. That is a first for a climate COP. We saw it at the biodiversity COP in Colombia just a few months ago. And I really salute them for that, because they are sticking their political neck out to do two things that don't yet have a lot of political public support, but that need it.
Can I ask you what do you think of the fact that, this COP is back in this is the lungs of the world. This is very different from the last two, which were in petrostates, UAE and Azerbaijan. Is that just a location issue, or do you think it actually bears any kind of meaning on results of what comes out?
It's very symbolic and very intentional. The COP presidency, in fact, the Brazilian government, very intentionally chose Belém, which is in the heart of the Amazon, to make their point. Let us not forget about the trees. Let us not forget about nature. And so the fact that we will all be there means we will not be able to forget that. But just in case we forget, they're going to put it on the negotiation.
Now, North Korea vowed to never give up its nuclear arsenal at a rare address to the United Nations General Assembly on Monday. The announcement comes at a politically unstable time with growing international concerns around nuclear proliferation. Amid these threats, a bipartisan task force has urged the United States to reconsider how it intercepts the expansion of this destructive industry. Ernest Moniz and Megan O'Sullivan, co-chairs of this task force, joined Walter Isaacson with their recommendations.
Thank you, Christian and Megan O'Sullivan and Ernie Muniz. Welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Nice to be here.
Megan, you and Ernie were among the co-chairs of a report that just came out, and I think it's published recently, on the Task Force on Nuclear Proliferation and U.S. National Security. What was the point of that, Megan?
The origins of the task force, I'd say, go back even just as far as 1964. And we think about, at that time, China detonated a nuclear weapon, and President Lyndon Johnson brought together a group of foreign policy experts to say, what does the next phase of potential nuclear proliferation look like? It was called the Gilpatrick Commission, and they came out with a number of recommendations and considerations that were then implemented and led to 60 years of essentially a period of minimal proliferation of nuclear weapons. We're now at a period where Ernie and our other co-chair, Tino Cuellar from the Carnegie Endowment, we assess that we're at a moment where the potential for greater nuclear proliferation has not been greater in decades. And so again, we are faced with a very rapidly changing geopolitical environment, one that we think lends itself to much greater proliferation of nuclear weapons. So we convene this bipartisan task force in an effort to, again, look at the question, is this a national security priority of the United States to advance non-proliferation? And if so, are the tools and the architecture that have withstood the test of time for 60 years, are they still well suited to today? And that was the reason that we convened that task force, and the results, as you said, were published just last week.
Ernie, as Megan said, it was chaired 60 years or so ago by Roz Gilpatrick, who was Deputy Secretary of State. But it was a Lyndon Johnson Presidential Commission. Y'all were self-organized. Is there a problem that we don't have, the government, the president, trying to figure this out?
Well, Walter, I think clearly, first of all, let me just say that this task force today came to the same high-level conclusion of the Gilpatrick Commission, namely that nuclear nonproliferation is indeed central to our security and should remain a priority. But this commission was a non-governmental commission, and one of our recommendations and I'll come back to your question, for example, was about the need to really rethink extended deterrence, how our allies consider U.S. security guarantees. There have always been uncertainties, but I would say now, going back to your question, today, some of the directions being taken in the United States by the administration, for example, they do elevate some of those concerns about reliability of U.S. commitments. So I would say that distinction really did come into play in our considerations.
So, Megan, Ernie just talked about extended deterrence, which those of you in the foreign policy business know what it means. But basically, it means don't get nuclear weapons of your own. Don't worry. We, the U.S., will use our deterrent capability so that you don't particularly need them. Do you think that's believable these days, Megan? Is that still a good policy? Why are you all supporting extended deterrence?
Well, there's two important points here, Walter. The first is, yes, the task force was unequivocal in saying that developing, maintaining a robust extended deterrence is absolutely essential to a successful continuation of non-proliferation objectives. Now, we recognize that it is harder today to make that a credible argument to many of our allies. And it's not just at this moment in time, it's really over the span of, multiple administrations that I think many of our allies are questioning America's commitment and reliability. Some of this just has to do with, it goes back to, is America overextended? And I would say particularly now, there are many allies who are questioning whether or not the United States will be willing to use the extended deterrent or to provide the extended deterrent. I think that was one of the reasons why we created the task force, is to say it's a changed geopolitical environment. You have China becoming, a country that has a very large nuclear arsenal. You have Russia now threatening the use of nuclear weapons. You have Iran, a proliferation threat like we haven't seen from Iran before, the current military force notwithstanding, and the questions over extended deterrence.
Ernie, we just heard Megan say that Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, has been throwing around the implication that he could use nuclear weapons. In a speech that President Trump gave to the military this week, he kind of addressed that. And he was talking about Putin saying, President Trump said he had moved to submarines because of it. And he says, we cannot let people throw around that word, the N word. And by N word, he meant nuclear. Do you think that President Trump is on this page, that we really have to keep a deterrence and also keep a non-proliferation policy?
Yes, I do, actually. And in fact, just to elaborate slightly on what Megan said in this context, part of the extended deterrence is, in fact, the idea that our allies need to, frankly, strengthen their military postures, and then have those postures integrated with our nuclear deterrent. Strengthening their conventional postures is, of course, very consistent with what the president has been advocating. I would also say that with regard to Russia specifically, but also I would say China, clearly a lot of the success in nonproliferation during the Cold War and beyond the Cold War came from great power relationships, the U.S. and the USSR, and then Russia, working together despite disagreements on a shared interest in nonproliferation. That continues today. It's a little bit creaky, shall we say, the great power coordination, but is something where we again recommend re-engaging in that despite the differences with both Russia and China. Now, President Trump, one other thing, Walter, I'll just add is that President Trump, long before he was president, going back to the 1980s, in fact, was speaking out against nuclear weapons. He has spoken many times about trying to decrease their role in our security posture. And in fact, it was just earlier this year in May where Vice President Vance explicitly said that the president, I think to use his words, hates proliferation, and I hate proliferation. So I think there are elements there to build on, and that's exactly what our report tries to address and to make suggestions. For example, I'll end by just saying that one of the recommendations is that the three countries perhaps even expanded to other nuclear weapon states, at least the 5 original weapon states, if not more, could, for example, collectively commit to not threaten or use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. Well, that would be an incentive for them, in fact, to stay
Well, Putin
non-nuclear.
just did the opposite.
I'm sorry?
Well, President Putin just did the opposite.
No,
nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear state, Ukraine.
Exactly, and that's one reason why I have said for sure that President Putin really crossed a line there and did something unprecedented. The idea here is it would be great to put that genie back in the bottle. It's not easy, but that kind of negative security assurance would be, we think, quite effective if we can get there. And I think the president would be interested in going in that direction.
Megan, talking about Ukraine, Ukraine had nuclear weapons when it ended up not being part of the Soviet Union anymore. And we convinced them to give up the nuclear weapons by saying, don't worry, you don't need them. We'll defend you. Boy, that doesn't make me feel very confident that we can talk other countries into doing that.
Well, I think there's, as you know, Walter, a very long history there and contested in some ways. But I think the big point that you're making is a very valid point, that many countries around the world not only look at Ukraine and giving up nuclear weapons that were on their soil when the Soviet Union dissolved, but they also look at the Libyan example or the Iraq example, and they think, countries that give up nuclear weapons or don't have nuclear weapons are ones that are subject to aggression. And they look at other countries, the most obvious one being North Korea, which is the only country in this century to have acquired nuclear weapons. Actually, against perhaps all odds, you see, the leader of North Korea comfortably in place. And so I think the lesson that many countries have is that pursuing a nuclear weapon could be in their national security interest. And again, the purpose of the task force is to ask how we can recalibrate our policy and upgrade our tools and the architecture that the international community has to kind of make sure that countries aren't making those kinds of calculations, so that they have, new or more credible incentives to stay non-nuclear. So one of the findings of the task force, which I think is very significant, particular in this political moment, is that, again, a bipartisan group of foreign policy national security experts all agreed that even the U.S. allies should not be in a position to gain a nuclear weapon, that's not in the U.S. interest, that it is in the U.S. interest to convince them not to pursue one. And the reason why this is so significant is some of your viewers may know that, there's an active conversation in Washington about, well, maybe it would be cheaper and more efficient and easier for the United States if some of our allies had their own nuclear weapon. We wouldn't have to provide that extended deterrent in the same way. And this group really concluded that's a very risky approach to take. And we need to invest again in finding a way to ensure that our allies, that they do not need to go down this road in order to guarantee their own security.
Arnie, how could you say with a straight face to the people of South Korea that now that we've allowed North Korea to get a nuclear weapon, they aren't safer and better off with one?
We think that we need to maintain our alliance, if you like, with South Korea. We continue to provide a nuclear deterrent, But what's really important is in an integrated way, improving our conventional capabilities. As a reminder, and you know this quite well, Walter, that the threats to South Korea are not simply from North Korea's nuclear capabilities. They have artillery lined up essentially along the border with South Korea that could pretty much annihilate Seoul. So it really comes down to an integrated regional strategy for security, and that's what we would advocate.
Megan, you're not just a defense expert, you're a whole foreign policy expert. And when we're talking about this, we talk about the need for Russia and China to work together with us to do it. That seems to me that we're in the least capable position we've been in for 20, 30 years to get both those countries to work with us. In fact, somehow we've driven Russia and China into a closer partnership, at least. There's so much we would need to do with both countries, from AI to climate to nuclear proliferation to bio to gene editing. Is there a way we can get back to having a more pragmatic relationships, especially with China?
The answer to your question is sort of twofold. One, in the report, we talk about how having a successfully rejuvenated global non-proliferation regime cannot be done by the United States alone. It has to be done with some kind of cooperation with Russia and China. We're not advocating an immediate resuscitation of talks. We're saying that we're hopeful and we would recommend that those talks happen as soon as is possible. But most important, I think we acknowledge and make the case very credibly that we still have common interest with both Moscow and Beijing in preventing more states from becoming nuclear weapons states. And so, you suggest, could we imagine a world in which we're having productive conversations with them across a very wide range of things? We're saying we should not wait until the relationship is that thawed to pursue these talks, that there are common interest among these three powers in having a world with less proliferation. And therefore, we should try to find ways to pursue this. It's actually interesting, on the day we released the report, it was the same day that Vladimir Putin said that he would be willing to adhere to the limits on the development of nuclear arsenals a year beyond the expiration of the New START treaty, which will happen in February. So in the absence of some kind of, temporary understanding, as of February 2026, the world will be without any limitations on the development of nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia for the first time in decades.
Well, let me follow up on that. Do you think the Trump administration will want to extend this, what's called the START Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Talk Treaty?
Yeah, I can't speak for the Trump administration, but it would make to me, and I think, I'll speak for myself at this moment, it would make to me a lot of sense to take Vladimir Putin up on that. I think there might be other motivations that Vladimir Putin has in extending that offer. Perhaps he's looking to, try to muddy the water between, be tough on Ukraine and nice on nuclear matters, or perhaps he's looking for limitations on the Golden Dome project that the Trump administration is committed to. But, without commenting on what other elements might come into that conversation, I would imagine the Trump administration would find it very much in its interest to have more time to be able to develop a follow-on to the New START. And this goes back to Ernie's point about how President Trump has been clear that he is not interested in seeing any more nuclear proliferation around the world. And so this is, this would be something that we should recognize as a positive step, although not mistake it for any kind of, warming of a relationship with Moscow.
Walter, can I just add that I think it's easy to be somewhat cynical about the offer. For one thing, the Russian economy is in no position to greatly expand its nuclear arsenal. Frankly, neither are we in a position to expand our nuclear arsenal right now, given some of the challenges in terms of so-called modernizing the arsenal. Nevertheless, completely agree with Megan that having those guardrails at least extended is a very, very good signal, and one that has to be capitalized on by having other discussions start. Despite the Ukraine situation, we can have other discussions. And by the way, New START, of course, it puts these quantitative limits on, which is what Putin offered to extend. But there are other elements as well in terms of inspections, very, very tricky in this current environment, in terms of data exchange, which could be still possible, certainly alerts in terms of missile tests. So I think the issue is, I very much hope the president will accept the offer, but accept it with the statement, and let's keep talking and get some other things in place.
Megan O'Sullivan, Arnie Muniz, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.
Thank you, Walter.
Next, a closer focus on the history of free speech. Our next guest says that anyone who thinks this right is uniquely under threat today is mistaken. Farah de Boivela is a historian at Princeton University. In What is Free Speech?, he traces it from the pre-modern age to our present day, and he's joining Walter Isaacson to explain what we can actually learn by looking back. This conversation took place before Jimmy Kimmel's show came back on air.
Thank you, Chris John and Farah de Boivela. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Walter.
Most recently in the United States, we've seen, with some government encouragement, a network taking off the comedian Jimmy Kimmel. What do you make of that in terms of free speech rights?
Oh, it's terrible. It's an abuse of governmental power. It's done in a way that really also shows up the power of the private media to shape public discourse. In this case, private corporation acting in its own interests rather than in the interests of the public has decided commercially and politically it's sensible to bow down to the current administration. And that's a terrible precedent for independent sources of news, for independent voices, which is one of the foundations of a flourishing democracy. We need to have independent news media that stand up to power, not just bow down to it. The other thing about this that is really remarkable and dangerous is that the FCC, like regulatory bodies in other spheres, the Federal Reserve, the FTC, there are many of them, are all bodies that are set up rightly in the public interest to regulate something that is very important to our community. It's not about individual rights, it's about the public interest. And they're supposed to, all these bodies are supposed to operate on a non-partisan basis, or at least a bipartisan basis, and not to be swayed, especially not to be swayed by government diktats. And that system is now being attacked and undermined by the current administration. It's extraordinary that a single person at the FCC, basically, even though it's the chairman, can make these kinds of pronouncements and wield this kind of power. That's a complete abuse of what the FCC is supposed to be doing and what it stands for and why it was set up.
You once had your own experience of having your free speech suppressed. Tell me about that, and what did that make you think?
Well, I had many experiences because I wrote a book on the history of sexual attitudes in the West. And that's a topic on which, conventions in different cultures differ about what you should say in public and what you shouldn't. But in particular, I went to China 10 years ago after my book was translated into Chinese. And first of all, my book was censored. The Chinese have different views on what you can say about sex, even in history. That was trivial. But what really profoundly shook me was going to China and seeing that the communist dictatorship there had put in place this extraordinary system of censorship whereby everything that anyone said in public was continually monitored, scrubbed clean, and forced to toe the party line. So that is clearly an oppressive dictatorial system that tramples all over individual rights of expression. And I came back from that visit knowing that this was horrible, knowing that I believed in free speech, and wanting to find out where that idea came from. Why do we all believe in free speech, and yet we can never agree on what it means within our cultures, across our cultures. And I'm afraid the bad news is that is because it is an essentially incoherent, weaponized concept, and it has been ever since it was first invented 300 years ago. The good news is, as my book shows, people have been puzzling over this for 300 years and come up with a whole lot of really interesting additional ideas, tools, theories of how to think about it that we really need to remember and pick up on, because our current mess is partly because we think about this in a very simple way, as free speech means just the individual right to say whatever you like, and censorship is always a bad thing and it always comes from government. Those are too simplistic a set of presumptions with which to approach this very complicated, very interesting, very important right and ideal.
So you've got the book on free speech. Let's go back to the beginning. To what extent is freedom of speech related to freedom of religion?
It's tangentially related, but there are many ways of arriving at the idea of free speech, and freedom of religion is just one of those. It happens to be important in the English-speaking world because the idea of freedom of conscience, which is the core of freedom of religion, comes out of the Reformation in the 16th and 17th centuries, and then people developed the idea, which is radical at the time, that you should be allowed to speak freely on spiritual matters without being persecuted or put to death, because ultimately human beings don't know the truth about salvation. And so it's better to discuss this and let God decide whether you're right or wrong. But that's a very limited idea of free speech. The modern idea that we now take for granted is really about political speech. It's the idea that every individual has the right to speak out on matters of public matters of public concern. And that's a development that doesn't take off until the early 18th century. And it starts first in England, and it starts there because it's a moment of communications revolution. Like our own day, freedom of speech becomes a hot topic when people are living through new kind of communications circumstances. And the media revolution of the 18th century is the revolution of print. So that's where it begins.
Well, the First Amendment gives it as an individual right. It's not saying that, hey, free speech will get you closer to the truth or be the best of things. This is your own individual autonomy to think, to worship, and perhaps to speak as you want. Isn't that what's different about the American Bill of Rights? Is that these are individual rights for moral reasons, not just for the good of society?
No, that's not. Americans would love to think that, but no, that's the case with pretty much any legislation enshrining freedom of expression and liberty of the press around the world from the 18th century. It's the most popular constitutional right across the globe from the 18th century, when people start writing down constitutions. But you do point to an important failing of our modern thinking more generally about freedom of expression, which is we tend to think of it as involving, on the one hand, the individual with the right, and on the other hand, the government with the power to censor. And already in the 19th century, people around the world, including in the United States, had come to see that that's an insufficient way of thinking about free speech, because you also need to look at the third very important power, which is the mass media. Who amplifies ideas, which ideas are more widely heard, more easily heard, which voices are suppressed. And from the 19th century onwards, people started to see that the mass media are very powerful. First newspapers, then broadcasting of various kinds. And that this power was not generally just there to advance the truth and promote the rights of citizens. Newspapers exist, and broadcasting was founded to sell advertising and to make money and to increase the power of the owners of these platforms. So out of that comes a very strong tradition, including in the United States, of thinking about the First Amendment as also something that involves the rights of the public more generally, and especially the right to truthful information. By the 30s and 40s in the United States, most people looking at the First Amendment have come to see that that's the key thing they need to focus on. How can we make the marketplace of ideas better able to support democratic deliberation? And for that, people start to experiment with ideas like public broadcasting, like regulating media. The FCC comes out of that, all sorts of arm's length bodies that are supposed to be non-partisan, not in the hands of the government, but trying to make sure that these very powerful entities amplify and moderate public discussion in ways that advance the truth. If you look at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights drawn up under Eleanor Roosevelt, the right to truthful information is part of how freedom of expression is defined there. And that's still the case in most other countries around the world.
Early on in the United States, even before the First Amendment, there was a sense, and this was true of England as well, that even if you printed something that was true, if it undermined society, if it undermined the government, it could be called seditious libel. And that was fought against both in England and the United States.
So seditious libel lies in the eye of the beholder. That's always the case. That's always the problem with defining freedom of speech in very balanced ways, that ultimately you end up with something very subjective. That's why everyone hates and finds it impossible to make watertight laws, because it's, communication is exquisitely contextual. It's not just about what you say, it's about who is saying it, about who the audience is, about all these things that we in normal communication can navigate. But once you start to make laws, that makes it very difficult. Laws are based on simplicity, transparency, everyone should be treated the same. And that becomes then a giant mess. And we see that around the world today.
So isn't there a problem with laws that try to restrict my own individual free speech?
Laws should be as minimal as possible when it comes to speech. The only thing that I would say is that we do need to acknowledge that speech can cause harm, not just individual actions, but, for example, the spreading of lies and untruth or libels of whole groups of people. We know from history that this can cause genocide, that it can really damage communal relations in all sorts of ways. And that's a problem. That's always been a problem. And so if we have guardrails in place, not against offense, not against people, having their feelings hurt, but against real harm, if we try and define real harm, then it's legitimate to have laws against that. And that's what people are trying to do around the world. The real problem at the moment is that public discourse everywhere has become taken over more and more by American online social media companies that now monopolize discourse. And they are operating from different principles. They're operating, first of all, from American principles that are more maximalist, more libertarian. But secondly, they're also operating, as all mass media in the past have, not in the public good, but to make money. And that is a different kind of incentive.
Do you think that you should force, say, online media companies to act in the public good instead of just acting for commercial purposes?
I think that the minimal thing that we should understand is social media companies are publishers. They're the most powerful publishers the world has ever seen. They are constantly amplifying certain messages, suppressing others. They are censors on a vast scale. So the minimal thing that we need as a society to require is transparency about how they're doing that. Simple transparency. What are their mechanisms that the algorithms are using to amplify certain messages and voices and suppress others? And then are they applying these consistently? That's all. That's not censorship. That's just requiring some kind of responsible transparency about their huge power to shape public opinion in the world today. And that's what people in Brazil are trying to do. That's what people in the European Union are trying to do with the legislation that's been put forward there. That's not censorship. That's an attempt to hold these giant corporations to account for the power they wield in shaping public discourse.
Let me quote something from your book, which you say a paramount purpose of laws and governments has always been to safeguard the public interest. But perhaps I'd say if you went back to the Bill of Rights, which is exceptional in the world, it's not the way other countries do it, that the paramount purpose of the Bill of Rights was to safeguard the individual's liberty, not just the public interest.
I think those two things are always in tension. And America has a wonderful, noble, proud tradition of individual rights. The First Amendment has a great history as safeguarding individual rights to political speech and political dissent and attacking the administration, all the things that are currently being trampled by the current administration. But on the other hand, you cannot have a society that works if you don't agree on certain ways of living together. The public good is a very difficult thing to define, but we do need to define it in order to live with each other. And so a minimalist understanding of what the public good might involve, for example, not being allowed to spread untruth and lies about really dangerous things, or that if you're engaged in political debate, you may not, in bad faith, just make it up as you go along. I think that would be helpful in just thinking about what free speech should mean and in policy making as well.
When you talk about maybe we should balance free speech with what's good for society and political reasons, do you worry that when a party you may not like is in power, they can use it? In other words, the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, saying things like we should crack down on hate speech, which slightly echoes a little bit of what you said earlier in the show, or the head of the FCC saying we should look at this.
I think what we're seeing in the United States right now is, first of all, an outrageous, hypocritical crackdown on free speech and on the accepted interpretation of the First Amendment. That's absolutely a problem, but it's a much bigger problem. We're seeing really an attempt to undermine independent sources of authority and to silence voices and opinions that the current administration doesn't like. And that's a really dangerous undermining of democratic process in general. So absolutely, at this point, we should be shouting from the rooftops that this is illegitimate. This is not the tradition that we as Americans are proud of. And ironically, the strong protections of the First Amendment that we currently enjoy come out of the first and second Red Scares, when something very similar happened. The idea that communists were beyond the pale, that their voices should be shut down without question, that homosexuals didn't deserve to be in government, all these kind of progressive, anti-progressive government attempts at censorship in the 19-teens and 20s and 1950s led to the First Amendment protections for political dissent that we currently enjoy. So this is really the third Red Scare, and its attempts to not just shut down particular voices, but shut down opposition to a would-be autocrat who is following the playbook that we've seen in other countries, in Hungary, in Turkey, in India, whereby you don't just suppress voices that you don't like, you try and cripple independent sources of authority, judges, institutions like universities, the independent working of scientists. And I think this is much more than just an attack on free speech. And we should be aware of that.
Farad Deboivola, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Walter.
Next, we turn to the United States, where the Trump administration is creating a task force to identify federal lands suitable for building affordable homes. Now, the initiative marks a first step by the Trump White House to address one of the worst housing shortages in decades. That shortage is part of the focus of the new book, Abundance. Co-authors Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson join Walter Isaacson to discuss how the crises we see today can be traced back to the regulatory policies of previous generations.
Thank you, Paula and Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Walter. Great to be here.
So, Derek, a few years ago, you coined the words the abundance agenda, and now this book sort of builds on that. Tell me what you meant by the abundance agenda.
This was January 2022, and I was standing in line in Washington, D.C. in the frigid air, waiting on a COVID test, which at the time were being rationed during the Omicron outbreak. And I thought to myself, it's kind of crazy that we are now 2 years into a pandemic and we don't have enough COVID tests. And I was thinking about the experience of the pandemic. I thought it wasn't just we don't have enough COVID tests. We don't or haven't had enough COVID vaccines. And before that, there was a scarcity of PPE for hospital workers. The pandemic, I thought, was really just this experience of one shortage after another. And as I zoomed out from the experience of the pandemic, I thought, it's not just this pandemic alone. It's really America in the 21st century that has dealt with one crisis of scarcity after another. There aren't enough homes, and as a result, affordability is a major crisis in American cities. We don't have enough clean energy construction in this country or many other countries, and that's one of the reasons why climate change has been so difficult to take down. And as I thought about all of the scarcities that have defined this modern age, I thought, well, what America needs most is the exact opposite. Not a reality of scarcity, but an agenda of abundance. And I thought this abundance agenda could take on housing to create an abundance of housing. It could take on clean energy. But far beyond that, you could look at all sorts of other blockages and bottlenecks in the economy, whether it's policies that limit the number of doctors we have or policies that make it harder for scientists to do their best work. We need to think about what an agenda for true American abundance would look like. And then yada, 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 we have a book.
So, Ezra, you've written a lot about this when it comes to housing, which is the core of this book in many ways. Really interesting part, including the shocking statistic that in the 1950s, housing was about twice as much as your annual salary. Now it'd be 6 times as much. Why is that?
Because in the places people want to live, we stop building homes. I mean, it's really that simple. I'm a Californian. I grew up in California. I went to public university in California. I then lived in DC for 13, 14 years and moved back to California, which is where I lived during a lot of the writing of this book. And Derek's experience of the pandemic has sort of been my experience of California. I love my home state. It is on the technological frontier. It is the cultural frontier. It is beautiful. So why is it losing hundreds of thousands of people every year to Texas, to Arizona, to Colorado, to Florida? And the answer is that the working class can't afford to live there, right? These families are my friends, right? I was in San Francisco watching people have kids and have to move away because they couldn't afford a home in the city that often they did essential jobs to protect or to serve. And parts of the book that we wrote are futuristic. Parts of them are about how we pull the inventions we want in the future forward into the present. Those are things that we don't yet know how to build. But there's no technical problem around building apartment buildings. The question of how to construct a house is solved. What is the issue here is politics, is process, is the ability to get people to say yes, and frankly, the process where you have to have so many people say yes along the way. And you've been looking at other problems in California. Why are we not going to hit our clean energy targets? Well, we've made it too hard to build clean energy. So Texas, which does not love clean energy the way California does, is building more clean energy than California is. What happened to high-speed rail? Sort of the same story. And at some point, you begin to realize what you have in a lot of big liberal states, it is true for New York, true for Illinois, true for others, is we have not focused as liberals on creating the supply of the things people need most.
Derek, as you just said, as liberals, and this book is written, both of you consider yourselves sort of liberal, moderate Democrats, but it's largely pushes back at the Democratic Party for being engaged in process, regulation. How much of the problem, let's stick with housing, comes from regulations and rules and everything and NIMBYism and zoning?
Something's happened to the identity of liberalism in this country. Between the 1930s and the 1960s, the New Deal era, we built and built and built, and it was a Democrat, FDR, that got us kickstarted on this habit of building. We built houses and roads. We built transmission lines and electricity. We built dams. We built canals. We built it all. And something happened, I think, to the identity of liberalism in the 1960s and 1970s, where we decided that the key to being a good liberal was being good at the politics of blocking rather than the politics of building. And there were lots of good reasons for this shift. The environmental situation in the 1950s America was horrendous. I mean, people were waking up to waters that were disgusting and air that was choked with smog. And so we made it harder for states and companies to change the physical world. But the medicine of the 20th century that we administered to this country has become the disease of the 21st century. It's simply become too difficult to build in this country. And too often, as we look in the mirror, we see that it is liberals who are responsible for this.
Ezra, why is that liberals did that?
The parties right now, the coalitions, have mirror image problems of each other. The personality type of the right is autocratic, and the personality type of the left is bureaucratic. Liberals are the rule followers, or the people who listen to the lawyers, right? Elon Musk does not listen to the lawyers, to put it gently. In a way, both sides could use a little bit more of what the other one has in excess. Liberals could use a little bit more of a knock it down energy. And certainly the right could use a bit more respect for systems, for institutions, for laws. This is not just a kind of searing act of self-criticism for no reason. Our goals are liberal ones. We've been talking about housing, but decarbonization is a huge part of the book. And one of the reasons it makes sense to aim that conversation at liberals is that they share our goals. We are liberals. We want to decarbonize. When the right builds fossil fuels at a torrid pace, when Donald Trump gets up there, as he has, and tries to destroy the solar and wind industries, which is what he is doing, he just doesn't share our goals. He's not trying to build the world we're trying to build. So there's a second problem, which is simply that our goals are liberal. And so if liberal states are not achieving those goals, like, that's an issue. It was true that for a while, as we were running through the natural space of this country, the question of how to block thoughtless development from happening was a very pressing question. We had functionally no muscle for doing that. Now, climate change inverts that. To conserve anything of the climate we've known for the entirety of human civilization, we have to build clean energy infrastructure at a torrid pace. And so now all of a sudden, to preserve the environment, instead of stopping things from happening, you need to make things happen very quickly. That requires new laws. It requires new ideas. It requires a new culture.
So, Derek, on the environmental issue, you in the book talk about the fact that the way the progressives and liberals tend to approach it is stop growth, stop growth. That seems to be antithetical to an abundance agenda. What should they be doing instead?
We need to reinvent what environmentalism means to face the challenges of the 2020s and not the 1960s. And the problems of today are that we cannot continue to grow by burning stuff we find in the ground. We have to use solar and wind and geothermal and, yes, even nuclear power to have a modern economy that people enjoy without destroying the biosphere. That means having a new relationship to building in the physical world and defining liberalism as what can you build and not what can you block.
So, Ezra, if you look at what President Biden did for clean energy and the infrastructure, there were many things, but one of them was to try to have electric vehicle charging stations across this country. I'll tell a tale about one of my Tulane students who ended up going into city government. He was so proud he was going to help build those charging stations in Louisiana because it's a state thing. And yet, by the end of it, they had built zero because every time he came up with a plan, they said, well, this plan doesn't fit our equity matrix, or it doesn't fit our labor standards, or it doesn't fit this. And so zero got built. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's absolutely what I'm talking about. There's another example like that, which is that in the infrastructure bill, a huge amount of the money in that bill, more than $40 billion, was earmarked for rural broadband. It's a great idea. That was passed in, I forget if it's late 2021 or early 2022. Either way, by the end of 2024, the number of people it had hooked up to broadband was approximately 0 people. You then wonder, why didn't they win? Right? You talk to the Biden people. I've spoken to them many, many times. I know you both have too. And they're very, very, very proud of the decade of infrastructure investment that they set off with the CHIPS Act, with the infrastructure bill, with the IRA. And I think in a way they're confused about why that didn't have more political upside for them. But one reason, maybe not the only, is that people didn't feel it. The money didn't move fast enough. Having, getting $42 billion for broadband isn't all that important if people don't get broadband. And a lot of the book is about this dynamic in which Democrats will pass a big bill. And it is sometimes at the national level, right? Like the Inflation Reduction Act, or it's sometimes at the state or local level. Like I report in some detail on Los Angeles's efforts to raise money to build affordable housing. And then you look at how it's implemented. And it is the amount of complexity layered onto it is astonishing. And a lot of these intentions are well-meaning. The equity intentions are well-meaning. You know, the environmental things you're building into it are good. But I was talking to somebody who builds affordable housing. And my God, have they been slow in doing that and using public money in Los Angeles? And she was saying that when she tries to build it, and she's housing people who live in tents under the freeway, she has to go back to the planning board. And they're like, well, you need a higher quality air filtration system because this development will be near a freeway. Higher quality, by the way, than a private development would have. And that's fine, but it is delaying housing when the alternative is people living in no house at all with no filtration system under an overpass underneath the freeway. Liberals should be much angrier about this than conservatives, right? This is a part of modern politics that upsets me. For conservatives, it's fine when government fails. They kind of want it to fail. That proves their point. Liberals should not be excusing it when it fails. They should be fixing it when it fails. They should be making sure it doesn't happen again. And that's what I don't see. That's, I think, the cultural change that needs to happen here.
Let me say that, Derek, there's been such a backlash that we now have, what Trump is doing, what Elon Musk is doing in government. But it's partly a backlash because, as Ezra just said, they were supposed to build broadband internet access and build zero. Whereas Musk and Starlink have put up 1 million since then, likewise put up, hundreds of thousands of chargers. Do you think this is what's causing this backlash that has led to people like Trump and Musk and others wanting to blow up the regulations?
Let's make no mistake. We have in this country a right-wing movement that is trying to destroy government, and not just destroy it to take it over, to purge it of all sources of potential pushback and ideological disagreement, right? Not a coincidence that we're turning over our telecom policy to Elon Musk himself, or that Trump is, getting out into the front lawn of the White House in order to basically make an advertisement for Tesla, or Tesla, as he calls it. We have a government right now which is defining or combining the worst parts of kleptocracy and kakistocracy, government by theft and government of the worst people. All that is to say, we need an opposition movement in this country that is popular and strong and competent. And it's a problem right now that Democrats and the left are unpopular and weak and often not competent in the places that they govern. To elaborate on Ezra's point, it's been a terrible political mistake to measure success in dollars authorized rather than things accomplished. That's how you get California authorizing $33 billion to build a high-speed rail system that doesn't exist. It's how you get a story of a $1.7 million toilet. Yes, $1.7 million public toilet built in San Francisco because the city has such procedural kludge. That's how New York City has the most expensive mile of subway construction in the world. It's how you get the Chicago mayor bragging on Twitter that they spent $11 billion to build 10,000 affordable housing units, coming out to $1.1 million per affordable housing unit. This is the record of a movement that has forgotten to judge political success by outcomes and instead has judged political success by how much money can we spend.
Boy, let me just ask you that, Derek. Why is there no Democratic city mayor who's making the city work?
Well, there are Democratic city mayors making the city work. I mean, there are Democratic city mayors, for example, in the state of North Carolina, in the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area, which is adding more residents than almost any metro in the country. That's where I'm living for this year. There are mayors who are making things work. It's happening. And many mayors and many governors are outcome-oriented. Jared Polis from Colorado is a great example of a governor, a Democratic governor, who I think is thinking in a very forward-looking way about the need for housing abundance. How do we bring down regulations? And also, how do we make it easier technologically to put up housing? Because if you can put up housing for cheap, then that reduces the price that people have to pay to live in those units. There are people on our side. There are YIMBYs who are younger progressives. There are people who are...
Explain what a YIMBY is real quick.
Yeah, well, there are people who are defining themselves, I think, as abundance progressives. There's people on our side, but we're trying to enlarge this movement.
I would add to that, the YIMBYs are the yes in my backyard folks, right? The YIMBYs have their center in San Francisco and California for all the intellectual victories and even statutes passed, bills passed, have not begun building more housing. This is very hard to do. Everybody wants to say, I passed a big bill on affordable housing. saying I went into the guts of the processes and I closed down a bunch of ways people in the community could come out and voice their objection to somebody building an apartment building down the block, that's a lot less popular. It's a harder fight. You often don't have the power to do it. Maybe the mayor wants to do it, but the board of supervisors doesn't want to do it. You see this all over, right? Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, he knows perfectly well what a problem the housing crisis is, both for California and for any presidential ambitions he might harbor. He has signed bill after bill after bill after bill. But the coalitional dynamics of this aren't easy. And that's why it does require, I think, some long, aggressive ideological change, because nobody wants to focus on process. Right? Nobody wants to hear about it. You don't win elections by saying, well, I've reconstructed the overlapping jurisdictional authorities that created 14 veto points in how we built a public restroom. It makes people in the agencies mad. They get mad at you. They leak things into the press. You have to see it as enough of a crisis to break some eggs. And again, I am, Lord knows, no fan of what DOGE is doing. But I do hope Democrats take one thing from it, which is that there's a lot that they have treated as inviolable in the way government works. A lot of rules, regulations, interagency processes, notes from their lawyers that weren't exactly laws. They were just sort of guidance. And they treated all of it as something that was a hard boundary. You just couldn't do anything about it. I mean, there is a dimension where I think liberals stop. Too many Democrats stop at the first sign of internal bureaucratic resistance. They treat the structure of government as too settled. The Republicans right now are treating it as completely unsettled, and they are trying to unmake it. They are trying to destroy it. I do not want American politics trapped between a party that will not make government work and a party that wants to make government fail. We are going to need, after the sort of institutional defenders that the Democrats became, the institutional arsonists the Republicans became, we're going to need some kind of synthesis, a party, a coalition, a movement that insists on making government work, not because it hates government, not because it doesn't want government to do big things, but precisely because it cares about government and it does want government to do big things.
Derek Thompson, Ezra Klein, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.